Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unknown Military History. And we know it's been a while, but we have returned, and we're starting a new series on the sort of founding of Rome and the early Roman Republic, which will cover this era all the way up to the Punic Wars, and it will be kind of a two-part series. But today we're going to start with the founding of Rome and the early founding of the Republic. So without further ado, let's go. Long before Rome reached its heights of glory, an area around the Aegean Sea was populated with various city-states and kingdoms, from the Mycenaean Greeks to Troy, where our story begins. It is the Bronze Age, a time where the first sparks of civilization started. The story of Rome's origins is shrouded in myth, and a lot of it is based on both Greek and Roman writings, but we'll be relying on Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid for this. And the city of Troy, which was in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was ruled by King Priam and his sons, who were Trojan princes. And they had maintained mostly neutral, but also strained relations with Greek city-states in mainland Greece that would eventually reach a boiling point when the Greek king of Sparta, named Menelaus, hosted a diplomatic party for the Trojans, but then the Trojan prince Paris fell for Menelaus' wife Helen and then abducted her. And those familiar with this story pretty much know it all by now. They flee to Troy, and a coalition of Greek city-states under Agamemnon declare war on the Trojans, and then a bunch of warrior heroes like Achilles and Hector make a name for themselves in the war and in death. And then finally, after many years of constant bloodshed, the Greeks trick the Trojans through the famous wooden horse and then sack the city, killing them all. But not all of them, because if we're going to be reading Virgil's Aeneid, there were some Trojans who survived the sack of Troy, and there begins the story of Aeneas, who was, if myth is to be believed, the son of the Trojan prince Anchises and the goddess of beauty Venus, or Aphrodite in Greek. And after the sack of Troy, Aeneas and the remaining Trojan survivors decided to journey westward, searching for a new home. And they were actually going towards Italy, but then a storm threw them off course, and they instead landed in the Phoenician city of Carthage. Now, Carthage was founded by, of course, as mentioned before, the Phoenicians, who were traders from the Levant. And they're led by Dido, who is a Phoenician princess that was forced to flee her ancestral homeland in Levant following a war or some sort of Bronze Age collapse, most likely. And she founded Carthage and would welcome the Trojan prince and his followers. And according to the Aeneid, Aeneas and Dido both fall in love, and they become lovers for about a year. But Aeneas is reminded by the gods of his real fate, and he decides to leave her and set out back to Italy to build a new city for the Trojan people. But after Aeneas sets sail, Dido breaks down from the loss, and she burns herself and Aeneas' possessions on a pyre and committed suicide. And as she was dying, she curses Aeneas and his descendants, which foreshadows the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, but that's the tale for the next episode. Back to Aeneas. After spending some time in Sicily, he finally reaches the Italian heartland, where he meets a Latin king named Latinus. And Latinus' daughter, Lavinia, was promised to Turnus, who was the king of a neighboring Italian people, but Latinus would instead marry her to Aeneas after hearing about his prophecy. And because of this, Turnus declares war on Aeneas. And in the ensuing battle, it's a tough battle, but Aeneas' Trojans prevailed, and Aeneas kills Turnus as revenge for Turnus' earlier killing of one of Aeneas' followers and close relatives at the beginning. And thus ends the tale of the Aeneid, written by the Roman poet Virgil, which details Rome's popular origin story. But there's a second story that follows the Aeneid, which details the actual founding of Rome itself. According to legend, King Numitor of Alba Longa's daughter, named Rhea Silvia, had two sons, named Romulus and Remus by the war god Mars, and they were all descended from the aforementioned Aeneas. And however, King Numitor was deposed by his treacherous brother Amulius. And Amulius ordered the two infants to be drowned in a river, but then they survived, and they washed ashore on the Palatine Hill, where they were cared for by a she-wolf until they were found by the shepherd Faustulus. and the twin brothers would work as warriors under the shepherd and his band. And once learning of their true identity, they attacked Alba Longa and killed their treacherous uncle Amulius and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne. And then the twins decided to set off and found a settlement on the site that they had been saved on by the wolf as infants. But during an argument over which hill the settlement should be on, Remus was killed by his brother Romulus, and Romulus would become the ruler of the settlement, which was named Rome. But the story doesn't end there, because, as I've said before, most of this is shrouded in myth, and most of what we're about to see regarding the 7 kings of Rome following Romulus is also shrouded in myth and mystery. And they were basically no different than any other ordinary kings of the ancient world, because they didn't really, inherit the title, and they were actually elected and answered to the Senate. And in the aftermath of Romulus' founding of Rome, he became its first ruler and would go down in history as the first king, or Rex in Latin, of Rome. And after founding Rome, Romulus recruited men from nearby areas to join him. And due to the fact that most of those early settlers were men, Romulus decided to secure some wives for them. And in doing so, he stole women from the nearby Sabine people, and this event would become known as the Rape of the Sabines. However, a truce was settled between Romulus and the Sabine king Tatius. However, after ruling Rome for 37 years, Romulus was said to have vanished suddenly amid a whirlwind during a storm and raised to heaven by the war god Mars. Other sources he was possibly killed by the Senate, but that's unlikely. After Romulus' death, Numa Pompilius assumed the title as the second king, and he was actually a Sabine, part Sabine. And unlike Romulus, his peaceful reign was mostly of a religious and cultural prosperity, and he moved the Vestal virgins, who were the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, to Rome, where they would remain for the next centuries to come. And his reign is marked with the founding of many religious temples and colleges, most notably the Temple of Janus. And he also added the months of January and February to the calendar, bringing the number of days in a year to 160 at a time. After Numa Pompilius died, and Tullius Hostilius became the third king of Rome, and he was the grandson of Hostus Hostilius, which was an old comrade of Romulus who had died in the Sabine Wars. And his reign was mostly known for its wars, most notably for his defeat of Alba Longa. Tullus, who wished to expand Roman territory, attacked the Alba Longa, killing their leader and welcoming their citizens as Romans. And Tullus would also campaign against the Fidenae people, conquering them. After this, he defeated their allies, the Ventines, at the Battle of the Anio River. However, a plague would suddenly strike Rome in the aftermath of this, killing the king Tullus. And many believe that Tullus's death was a sign of divine anger, since he did not prioritize religious rights for the gods. And with his death, the election of a man named Incus Marcius came into power as a fourth king, a grandson of Numa Pompilius. And Incus was also a warrior king like Tullus, who conquered some of the neighboring Latin cities and moving their people to Rome. And his most notable achievement probably was founding of the port city of Ostia, which still stands to this day. And the fifth king of Rome was Tarquinius Priscus, who was actually an Etruscan and a Corinthian, so part Italian, part Greek. And during his youth, he had moved to Rome and joined the court of Ancus Marcus. And becoming king, he helped to defeat a number of Rome's neighbors, such as some of the Latin tribes, the Etruscans, and the Sabines. And he also expanded the Roman circus, which was a series of games that provided public entertainment. And Rome was also expanded architecturally through the construction of a massive sewer system and the Temple of Jupiter, and the Senate was also expanded. And then after his death, a man named Servius Tullius became the sixth king, and he instituted Rome's first ever census court in order to determine representatives in the Senate based on area. And he also divided the Roman citizenry into separate tribal classes, such as pure-blooded Roman, or part Roman, part Italian, and then whoever else was there. And then, however, Solius would be overthrown by a man named Tarquinius Superbus, who was also another Etruscan, and what followed was a despotic regime, because Tarquinius Superbus held absolute power and executed many senators for opposing him. However, Brutus and other opposition senators in the Senate decided to stage an uprising, and in the coup that followed, Tarquinius Superbus was overthrown, and Rome's monarchy would fade into history and be replaced briefly by the Roman Republic, which this event really does foreshadow the later Brutus's assassination of Julius Caesar. But the story doesn't really end here, because despite this, Tarquinius didn't actually die during the coup, he just escaped. And he allied with the Etruscans, the Veii, and the Tarquinii, and a bunch of other petty tribes in order to attack Rome and reclaim his crown. But at the Battle of Silvia Arcia, the Romans defeated Tarquinius Superbus and his allies. And this still doesn't end here, though, because Lars Porsena, the king of Clausium, another small Italian tribe, decided to send aid to Tarquinius and then marched on Rome. And the Roman defense of the Passage Bridge would be forever immortalized as Horatius on the Bridge, because during this particular event, if you're reading the traditional myths, a group of a couple Romans supposedly held off an entire army for a time while waiting for reinforcements. And Tarquinius would, in the aftermath of this, again try to retake Rome, but get defeated in battle again. This is at least the third or fourth time already. And then he left his last years in exile. And thus, the Roman monarchy officially ended from this point on and gave rise to a republic. And the term republic itself, if you're looking at the definition of it the Roman way, it just means public good. And basically, the people elect representatives to make decisions for them in government, which is how the republic should be. And the Roman Republic had three branches of government, similar to the United States. The Senate of Rome, which was its legislative branch, made up of 300 patricians, or the wealthiest families in Rome. And the Roman Senate was Rome's most powerful branch, and its members served for life. And its executive branch was made up of 2 consuls who were elected yearly, and the consuls of Rome held considerable power in the government, as they could veto decisions made by the other. And the judicial branch consisted of judges, known as praetors, who were elected yearly by the people of Rome. And in the Republic's early days, all government officials came from the wealthy patrician class, which led to the plebeians, or the lower classes, which made up of the bulk of the citizenry without power or representation. And in 494 BC, an event known as the Struggle of the Orders would occur. Since most of Rome's army was made up of plebeians who had little say in the government, they just decided to refuse their service and then start their own settlement elsewhere. And then they were followed by basically all the other plebeians in Rome's citizenry. And due to this, reforms were made, and tribunes were added to Rome's legislative branch with the role of representing the plebs. However, in 451 BC, the plebs decided to pressure the Senate to write laws known as the 12 Tables, which was set in Rome's forum for all to see the law. And the additional Licinian law in 376 BC would further give away the plebs' rights by stating that one of the consuls must be of pleb origin. However, there are many other pieces of Roman government which would prove drastic and play a major role in the late Republic many, many years later. And this feature was the dictatorship. And due to the often timely process of the government decision-making, there's one problem that did arise, and this was when swift action became necessary during, a state of emergency, a war, other stuff like that. And to combat this issue, a dictator would be appointed by the Senate who could make his own decisions without consulting the Senate. And the majority of them were military generals, since many of the Republic's crises revolved around a war due to an invader. And one example of this occurred in 458 BC, when Rome, faced with enemy armies from neighboring peoples, a guy named Cincinnatus, who was a retired consul and general, decided to accept the role of dictator to defend Rome. And Cincinnatus led an army and defeated Rome's enemies, but then after 16 days of the dictatorship, he retired once he completed his task. And he was basically an example of the ideal Roman, in a sense, due to his actions. Now, we're going to get to the Gauls. And the Gauls were one of the major barbarian groups the Romans would face in their history. And they were a Celtic people, mainly living in the Alps in modern-day France. Of course, if you know about Julius Caesar, he led the campaign to conquer Gaul, but this was way before that, when Gaul was made up of many different tribes who, some of them migrated down to Italy, some of them even migrated to Greece. And there was a time when a Gallic tribe known as the Senones began moving south into central Italy near Rome, and they were led by a man known as Brennus, who was a warlord that conquered and sacked many parts of the Etruscan kingdom in the north of Rome, and then once he was finished with that, he decided to march on Rome itself. And Brennus's Gauls would meet the Romans at the Battle of Allia, and the center of Rome's battle line was made up of men mostly fighting in a phalanx formation typically used by the Greeks, because maniples and then triarii, hastati, and principes weren't invented at this time yet. So the Roman flanks, on the other hand, were pretty much made up of poorly armed men who were routed easily by the Gauls and then surrounded and then annihilating the Roman center. And the Battle of Allia would go down as Rome's first serious military defeat. And then the Gauls marched on Rome itself. And one account tells of how sacred geese living in a temple on top of the Capitoline Hill warned the Romans of the advancing Gauls. And though the Gauls sacked Rome itself for the first ever time in its history, this wasn't the end. And the Gauls then looked south at Ardea, which was one of the cities controlled by Rome. And there was an exiled Roman general who was named Camillus, and he organized local forces to defend the city. And with these forces, he caught the advancing Gauls by surprise, who were distracted by their spoils at night. And many Gauls were killed in the ensuing battle, and then Camillus was invited back to the city and appointed dictator by the Senate after his victory. But Brennus and the surviving Gauls were still alive, and there were still a lot of them, and the Romans tried to negotiate a peace through payment. However, when they pointed out how Brennus's negotiations tried to use heavier weights than standard for weighing gold in order to cheat the Romans out of a fair peace due, Brennus rebuked their complaints by throwing his sword and belt on the scales, shouting in Latin, Vae Victis, meaning woe to the conquered. And according to Roman historians, at this moment, Camillus suddenly arrived with a Roman army and put his own sword on the scale, saying, Non auro sed ferro recuperanda est patria, which meant not with gold, but with iron will the fatherland be avenged. And the ensuing battle saw the Gauls getting completely routed by Camillus, and Rome was saved. And Camillus was thus dubbed as a second Romulus for his heroism in defending Rome and then rebuilding it in the aftermath of the sack. And while Rome was being rebuilt, the Volsci and the Aequi attacked the Romans, while the Etruscans and Latin rebels decided to conduct border raids. And thus Camillus was appointed to be the dictator a second time, defeating the Volsci at the Battle of Maecum, conquering the Aequi, and recapturing all of Rome's lost territories from the Etruscans and the neighboring Latin tribes. After these victories, Camillus celebrated a triumph in Rome, and he would serve as a dictator for several more times when the Gauls tried to invade yet again multiple times. And in total, he served 5 dictatorship terms. And this will mark the end of our first episode from here, because in the next episode, we will be detailing the Roman conquest of Italy now that it begins to look outwards, as well as their wars against Pyrrhus of Epirus.